You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C.
Thanks for joining me as usual, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. I'm still reeling from this new news about North Korea. So just to contextualize things for our listeners, we're going to be talking about the U.S.-North Korea diplomatic process again, because there's always more to say about that. But just before we started recording this podcast, there was a particularly important new bit of information that came out courtesy of a report at Vox by Alex Ward, who was told by sources in Washington, D.C. that one of the concessions that the United States specifically delivered to North Korea, apart from the declaration included in the Singapore statement that Trump and Kim signed to have both countries work towards a peace regime, Trump apparently specifically said that the United States would sign an end-of-war declaration soon after the summit. So that's kind of one of the things that's been simmering behind the scenes. But yeah, Prashant, there's a lot to talk about. August has kind of led to this fizzle in U.S.-North Korea diplomacy, a predictable fizzle, if I might say so. But yeah, so where do you think we should start today?
I think, probably a good place to start would be just this whole sort of, ongoing conversation about Trump has taken a very unconventional approach when it comes to North Korea. And I think initially observers have been giving him kind of the benefit of the doubt for the most part, sort of saying that given the fact that other approaches have been tried and they haven't worked before, let's just kind of see how this plays out. So things like planning for a potential summit and making preparations and kind of escalating slowly to the leaders level, that's been kind of turned on its head.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I mean, since we've seen the sort of Singapore summit meeting between the two leaders, there's been this ongoing conversation about, why hasn't there been progress? Has this kind of stalled? Is it better characterized as a failure of this initiative or policy? I don't sense that we have a clear sense of whether, what this actually is. But I certainly think that relative to where we were at the beginning of the year, where folks were saying, sort of give this a chance, we are seeing a little bit more ambivalence now about where that is. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is we really don't know to what extent some of this recalibration and stories being leaked and revelations have to do with how both sides are kind of playing things up and there's actually more progress going on behind the scenes,
Right.
or whether this is actually a case of this approach, as we've kind of predicted at the outset, it's a very risky gamble that is actually not paying off. So I do think that that's kind of the big question that kind of is pending.
Right. So I think what we're seeing now is sort of the risk that many of us had sort of identified when the Singapore summit was first announced, or at least the meeting between Trump and Kim was announced on March 8th. The risk always was that you put Trump in a room with Kim Jong-un or a senior North Korean official, for example, Kim Yong-chol, when he traveled to Washington, D.C., and there's really no telling what he might verbally agree to. And as we've seen with this administration, Trump's utterances aren't always the same thing as U.S. policy. So that's kind of the place we're in right now. So it would seem that, we saw this at the Singapore summit when at the press conference, Trump, received quite a bit of flack for calling the defensive U.S.-South Korea military exercises war games and calling them provocative. Clearly, that was something that he'd been told by the North Koreans, and it immediately imprinted on him, and he sort of expressed that as his own view. And similarly, it seems that earlier on, perhaps as early as Kim Yong-chol's trip to Washington right before the Singapore summit, Trump had agreed to an end-of-war declaration, which, by the way, is an inter-Korean objective as well. The two Koreas are particularly keen on accomplishing a declaration to end the war by the end of 2018. That's not the same thing as a peace treaty regime, which would come after a peace treaty, and the peace regime is something that's alluded to in both the Singapore statement and the Panmunjom Declaration between the two Koreas. But this issue of the end-of-war declaration now is sort of coming due. The North Koreans reportedly are asking the United States why it's sort of holding back. So this letter recently that the White House received, or Pompeo received, from Kim Yong-chol. Kim Yong-chol, by the way, is Pompeo's counterpart in these talks with North Korea. He's the former head of North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, a trusted loyalist to Kim Jong-un. He's been charged by North Korea with sort of handling the implementation phase of the Singapore talks. So according to the head of the South Korean National Intelligence Service in a report by the Hangkorea newspaper from South Korea, the letter from Kim Jong Chol reportedly demanded an assurance from the United States that it needs to deliver on this end of war declaration. And the urgency is obviously high because in September we have the 5th Inter-Korean Summit, the third between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, coming up in Pyongyang. And the South Koreans are naturally anxious now, given the breakdown in the U.S.-North Korea diplomatic talks. And the other issue here that bears mentioning, this we've seen the North Koreans talk about this in their propaganda, is the sort of obviously the denuclearization issue has not gone away. In fact, it's become a more prominent feature of the U.S. negotiating position in the weeks since the Singapore process. So apparently Pompeo has been bringing, when he traveled to Pyongyang in early July, the visit after which North Korea said was a regrettable attitude by the United States with sort of a gangster-like attitude. Apparently Pompeo proposed that North Korea ship some percentage of its warheads to a third country. But the North Koreans effectively see the United States as sort of reneging on the promises that were made by Trump at the Singapore summit. So it's understandable why this process is starting to crumble, and it puts the administration in a bit of a corner now, because either they have to deliver on what Trump promised the North Koreans, which is something, by the way, that John Bolton, Jim Mattis have their reservations about. The end of war declaration, while it doesn't imply a peace treaty, it creates the political circumstances on the peninsula that really create momentum towards a peace treaty that the United States has long had reservations about for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with the future of the U.S.-Korea alliance and the future of the United States and East Asia more broadly. So that's sort of where we are right now, and it's really hard to say where things go, but it's hard for me personally to see a positive path out of this. I mean, we've seen U.S.-North Korea negotiations fall apart in the past because of these kinds of misunderstandings and misalignments and priorities, and to me it looks like it's happening again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the point you made about words mattering in terms of North Korea issue is really important. I mean, the North Koreans for a long time, history of negotiations, have been very good at using words or promises that the United States has offered, and spitting those back to the United States and saying, you have not delivered and you're not a credible partner, even as the United States kind of does the same thing. So it really does matter, even if President Trump doesn't think so. The North Koreans do scrutinize language and statements very carefully, and they will use that as a weapon in ongoing negotiations. I think the other thing that you pointed out that's really important to emphasize for listeners is, I mean, there is sort of a domestic debate too on North Korea policy. There were folks at the very beginning when this happened that already expressed skepticism about, any kind of potential for engagement happening, and the North Koreans were never really serious about not only denuclearization, but kind of any inroads in terms of negotiations in the United States, and that they really were interested in kind of pursuing their weapons program and then also splitting the U.S. from South Korea. And I think that debate continues to play out. And one of the interesting questions is, if we continue to see not a lot of progress on this front, how does that affect domestic political dynamics? I mean, John Bolton and some of the other more skeptical members of the Trump administration, does that kind of give them leverage to then propose to President Trump that he should take kind of a more hardline stance and position on this issue? Because, I mean, let's face it, I mean, for the Trump administration, this is a kind of, I mean, foreign policy matters only to a certain degree in U.S. domestic politics, but this is a midterm election year, and Trump has made this a very high-profile issue. And so I don't think he'll want to admit, characteristic of President Trump, that he's sort of failed in any way. But I also think that this has domestic political implications for how U.S. policy works and those kinds of debates as well. And I do think, one of the other things that we do need to keep in mind is, I mean, what is the reality on the ground, right? So there have been reports that have been surfacing over the past few weeks. I mean, you've done a couple as well about, what are the North Koreans actually doing with respect to the nuclear missile program? How are they actually behaving in terms of some of these specific metrics? And so I think one of the things that'd be useful for us to do is to kind of provide, what have the North Koreans been doing so far in terms of these developments, right?
Yeah. That's probably useful to talk about and just to lay out for our listeners here. So in both the April 27th agreement and the June 12th agreement, North Korea committed to quote-unquote complete denuclearization. And that's a tricky phase because to a layperson, that sounds like the North Koreans agreed to give up their nukes. But in the context of what that means in the long history since 1992 of the word denuclearization being used in the Korean Peninsula context, it's a trickier topic. For the North Koreans, denuclearization, complete denuclearization, refers to something more like global disarmament or bilateral arms reductions with the United States. It does not refer to, above all, unilateral disarmament. And the North Koreans have been clear about this for a long time. In May, some listeners might recall that Trump suddenly called off the summit meeting with Kim Jong-un after the North Koreans released a nasty statement about John Bolton. And the reason for that statement was because Bolton had been talking about the Libya model, which was unilateral nuclear disarmament with warheads being shipped away and sort of disposed of off-site. And the North Koreans said, look, this is not what we're interested in discussing. It is simply not what we're willing to do. If you want to talk to us in the spirit of a different kind of good faith process, we're interested in talking, but unilateral disarmament is not on the agenda. And they've been clear about this, right? This is not an example of the North Koreans now cheating, because yes, there has been evidence that the North Koreans are continuing to build out their arsenal. Even Pompeo couldn't get around that when he had to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in, I believe it was late June. He said that they were continuing to produce fissile material. So all of this is continuing, but it's not evidence that the North Koreans are really cheating the United States or sort of going back on the agreements they made at Singapore. It's really the North Koreans really doing precisely what they said they would do. You can go all the way back to the New Year's Day speech that Kim Jong-un delivered this year on January 1st when he directed North Korea's munitions industry and the ballistic and the Nuclear Weapons Institute to mass produce warheads and ballistic missiles. And yeah, we have seen signs that that kind of activity is ongoing. They're producing launchers for their new solid fuel missiles. They're producing new ICBMs. There's a chance that we might get to see some of this hardware actually very soon. So, maybe looking forward a bit, Prashant, September is a huge month, not only because of the upcoming inter-Korean meeting, and also because of the dramatic state in which U.S.-North Korea relations are right now in the post-Singapore era, but also because Chinese President Xi Jinping is probably going to show up in Pyongyang on September 9th for the 70th anniversary celebrations of North Korea's founding. And looking at satellite imagery of the parade preparation grounds near Pyongyang, it looks like North Korea is going to hold another military parade. They'll be flexing their military muscles for the first time since February 8th this year, which was one day before the start of the Winter Olympics with South Korea. And the Winter Olympics, our listeners might recall, were the initiation of the dramatic inter-Korean rapprochement that led to the Panmunjom summit in April. So North Korea really hasn't been showing the world its missiles and its warheads, but we look to be getting a parade soon, and they're going to remind the world that, yes, these weapons are still here. We're not denuclearizing. And no better way to do that than to hold another military parade. So I'll also be curious to see how Trump reacts, because I think you're absolutely right about the domestic political angle here, that there is a lot riding for Trump on this. Certainly the way he presented the Singapore summit, the day after he said that there was no more threat from North Korea, that's going to be a fiction that's growing increasingly difficult to sustain, I think. Even with the Trump-focused media out there like Fox News, they've been starting to acknowledge that yeah, the North Koreans are sort of continuing their activities. So in the lead up to the midterms, this is going to turn into a big issue, especially if this process continues to grow more acrimonious. If the United States, if within the administration, Mattis, Bolton, Pompeo, Trump can't sort of come around to essentially an agreement that they will have to concede this end of war declaration, I think the process just ends up blowing up. And that's also a huge blow to the U.S.-South Korea alliance, because the South Koreans are on board. Part of Moon's rapprochement with North Korea is premised around the idea of finally ending the Korean War. That's something the two Koreas have agreed on. So if the United States becomes the spoiler here, that's not only a bad outcome for the U.S.-North Korea process, but also for the U.S.-South Korea alliance, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think that's one of the interesting things that we'll see in the coming weeks, which is this idea that's always kind of been in the background, that there is a potential that the United States and the Trump administration may not be satisfied with the degree of progress they're making with North Korea, but the South Koreans may be. And in a sort of series of engagements where Kim Jong-un is engaging with South Korea, is engaging with China, is engaging with Russia, might this be a process where eventually or slowly and gradually we are looking at a place where the United States is increasingly left out of a process where the North Koreans are now engaging more with the South Koreans and these other partners. And what does that mean for where the United States stands in U.S. policy? I think very interestingly, you're seeing, U.S. officials and anonymous sources in the last few weeks mentioning caution on this point, right? That there is a risk, really, that the South Koreans are willing to go at this alone, in spite of the fact that the United States isn't happy with the degree of process there. And I think, you're right in terms of cautioning about what that means for the alliance, because it does sort of lead to some differences of opinion for the U.S.-South Korea alliance.
That's right. And I think a scenario we're also heading towards is, there's always the nagging issue of sanctions relief. And the South Koreans have been quite realistic about that. And I heard that when I was in Seoul as well, that the South Koreans are not rosy-eyed about the prospects for sanctions relief. But what they've been doing since April and even earlier is really any kind of inter-Korean activity that is possible and legal under the current sanctions regime, with a few exceptions. The issue of a liaison office in Pyongyang, something that the Panmunjom Declaration set out, has turned into a controversy. Some in the United States sort of see that as a joint venture with North Korea, which would violate existing Security Council resolutions. But otherwise, every kind of inter-Korean activity, sports tournaments, they've even had magician exchanges. Obviously, the family reunions just happened in late August. All of that has been ongoing to sort of keep up the spirit of progress. And now if the United States becomes a spoiler, and certainly the United States doesn't appear to be heading in the direction of supporting any kind of sanctions relief for North Korea before concrete action, whatever that might mean, on denuclearization, I think the South Koreans will eventually find themselves having more in common with China and Russia at the P5 level at the Security Council in terms of the way to proceed on sanctions relief for North Korea. And if sanctions relief does come for North Korea, it's probably going to come with rollbacks to some of the sectoral sanctions that were enacted in 2017 on sort of entire sectors of the North Korean economy. Things like textiles, for example, a major source of revenue for North Korea, potentially increasing the cap on oil exports and oil imports and coal exports from North Korea. But all of that right now is not on the agenda in Washington. The U.S. approach continues to be the old one of until the North Koreans effectively give up all their nukes, there won't be a single piece of sanctions relief. So that's really going to grow untenable if this next inter-Korean summit turns out to, again, regenerate momentum. And there's also the other possibility that the next inter-Korean summit is actually less comfortable than the first one this year in April, because that one was a truly historic event. And then there was a second one in late May after Trump canceled the summit, where Moon had to sort of impromptu call up Kim Jong-un and try to save the process. But now Moon, I think, will face a little bit more difficulty here, because the North Koreans are getting impatient on this issue. And the South Koreans are also in a difficult position because, they've been trying to communicate the U.S. position to North Korea, but there's been little interest in doing that. They've more been kind of trying to explain the North Korean position to the United States, which is important, I think, for this administration, certainly, but not really where we're going. Anyways, so we have a little bit more time left on the podcast, so why don't we move on to something a lot more complicated than North Korea? I'm joking there, but it might seem that way sometimes with Australian politics. Last week, I guess the Australian government totally melted down due to an internal Liberal Party sort of leadership spill. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because we had a similar spill in September 2015. So the Liberal Party ousted Malcolm Turnbull over a variety of sort of internal issues, and now Australia has a new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, slightly to Turnbull's right within the party. Morrison was, again, flanked on his right by Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, who sort of initiated the challenge to Turnbull, but ended up sort of falling short of the votes necessary within the party to come out on top as Prime Minister. So Turnbull is expected to leave Australian politics later this week. But yeah, this, I think, Prashant, highlights the sort of instability of political leadership in Australia more broadly. And, I think that has implications for Australian foreign policy, certainly. I think Morrison has tried to preserve a degree of continuity in his administration. The new cabinet, for example, moves over Marise Payne, the former defense minister, into the foreign affairs portfolio. So she's now the new foreign minister, replacing Julie Bishop. And she's a well-known figure to regional partners for Australia, particularly in Southeast Asia, and the like. So that's a positive mood. But yeah, what's your broader take here? I mean, we've kind of seen this kind of lingering challenge for a lot of countries, right? I mean, I am a little bit surprised by Australia because if you'd asked me a few months ago, where I'd be expecting some kind of dramatic political overturn, potentially it might have even been Japan, where Prime Minister Abe's scandals made him look precarious just a few months ago. But yeah, here we are in Australia with the new government. So what's your reaction here?
So I think twofold. One is what you highlighted earlier, which is, you have seen this kind of wave of populist sentiment across several countries around social issues, political issues, and the like. And Australia, you could argue either way, but I do think, there is a school of thought that says that the Australians have just kind of staved off another potential populist wave in the Australian context, because if Peter Dutton had taken over, given some of his positions on social issues, including rights of Aborigines and things like that, um, that would have been major discontinuity for Australia. But the fact that they don't have that is sort of more of a signal of continuity than it otherwise would have been. So that's kind of the domestic political context. But I think the other one is what you highlighted as well, which is, we have this growing conception of the Indo-Pacific, which kind of nets together this even more sort of wide and expansive range of allies and partners. And the question's always been, when you have political alignment among various leaders, what happens if one or two of these individuals actually lead the scene? And you saw this. I mean, this is important because during the George W. Bush administration, as you and I have discussed before, you had the Quadrilateral Agreement, and you had similar leadership dynamics affect the sustainability of how that security arrangement took place. And so now, the one of the other things that I think is going sort of in the back of people's minds is, to what extent will you see some of these leadership changes affect strategic cooperation and alignment between these countries? And like you said, I mean, there's reasons to worry on several counts, right? Whether you've had Prime Minister Abe in Japan and some of that shakiness initially, you have Prime Minister Modi, who's been a source of continuity with respect to India, but folks are not sure how long he's going to last. I mean, there's elections coming up, and he might stick around for a while. But with all of these countries and leaders, I think there's always sort of a two-parter, right? It's great that we're seeing this promise and this alignment, but will we see this under a future leader that emerges? And for Australia, that's, I guess, even more of a consideration, given that we've had now four prime ministers in a decade, right? And none of them have finished their terms completely and then done a second term. And it's also a parliamentary system, which always creates its own sort of dynamics.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, the issue here, though, I think, has really been the internal party dynamics in the Liberal Party itself. So
Hmm.
the sort of populist nature of this is a little bit less clear to me, I guess. It really does seem like sort of inter-party jockeying, and the Liberal Party certainly does have its polls, right? I mean, Turnbull, I guess, comparatively was pretty liberal compared to a guy like Dutton, who is perhaps more Trump-like or more far right in his preferences more generally. But that sort of is kind of where the unpredictability comes in. So, there were inter-party disagreements here about Australia's approach to climate change, for example, that might now become a change in Australian foreign policy, more broadly speaking. But yeah, these issues, I think, are always worth keeping an eye on, the domestic politics of these major players in the Indo-Pacific. And it's certainly, we've talked about this before as well, but it's something that a country like China doesn't have to really deal with, right? We pretty much know that Xi Jinping is going to be sticking around unless there's some kind of catastrophic, unforeseen event that results in a major crisis in China. But yeah, these parliamentary democracies don't have the same sense of stability.
Yep, and I think you're right to point to these other issues that sometimes get a shorter shrift relative to some of the geopolitical and security concerns, right? One is energy policy and climate change, which was a major driver, and then this kind of leadership shift and the contemporary dynamics. But another one's also the fact that Scott Morrison was also one of the individuals who was kind of more in the camp of making sure that refugees don't get brought into Australia
Hmm.
and sort of turning away boats
Hmm.
of these individuals. And
Right.
that's something which has animated Australia's relationships with its neighbors for a long time. And so I do think that some of these areas where we might not necessarily see a lot of focus on might end up be the ones that sort of bedevil relations of Australia and some of these neighboring states.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I guess we'll leave it there for today.
Sounds good.
Right. Well, thanks for joining me as always, Prashant. For our listeners, if you like what you heard and you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please do so. You can do so either on iTunes, Google Play, or any number of other podcast providers. And if you have been a subscriber but you haven't left us a review, that would be really appreciated on either iTunes or Google Play. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.